Right, hi everyone. We are jumping into chapter 7 today, full 40 verses of Paul's pastoral wisdom to the Corinthians. Have a read through it. Ideally, again, hit pause on this if you haven't already. Have a read through. It is comprehensive. It's a very full, comprehensive response Paul is writing because of questions that the Corinthians have asked. Until now, he's been dealing with reports that he's had of dicey stuff that's going on, but they seem to also have written to him and asked some questions. And in particular, the question they're asking in verse 7, they're saying, is it actually good, or it is, I think how they've written it is it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with women. They've said to him, Paul, maybe it's best, all things considered, that we just don't have sex. Maybe sex fundamentally is a problem and we need to get rid of it out of our marriages and certainly out of all parts of life outside of that. But they're even saying within marriage, maybe it's just too much of a risk, too much of a temptation, too much of a source of problems. And so they've written to him to ask this question, and that is obviously coming out of this aggressively sexualized culture. The temple to Aphrodite, the temple prostitutes. They got Christians who are going to visit prostitutes. We see in chapter 6, they've got some crazy incestuous affairs going on within the church. They are inundated, and their understanding of healthy sexuality seems to have been horribly corrupted by everything that's going on around them. And many of the members of the church have come out of that society. It's not something they've just recently been exposed to. This is what they've grown up with. And they are, best case scenario, doing their best to be holy. But I think fundamentally, they're trying to figure out how to balance grace and liberty as a Christian with the moments that it seems to clash. All things are permissible, but are all things beneficial? That sort of moment with their attempts to be holy. And so I think what I want to do today is I want to look more broadly at that dynamic and how we respond and how we understand our lives in terms of Christian liberty. A similar example, but not within the realm of sex, would be alcohol use. And so I was just reflecting on our time in South Africa. And South Africa, like many countries, but it has a significant alcoholism problem, particularly in the townships and squatter camps that surround many of the cities. Incredibly densely packed. There's massive unemployment. All sorts of social problems, and alcohol has a massively negative effect on those communities. So much so that during COVID, at the height of COVID, the mortality rate actually dropped in South Africa. So less people were dying per month in the height of COVID because the government banned alcohol sales. And so there was so much alcohol-related trauma that was then stymied largely during those bans, that there on a net were actually less people dying. That's just an example of how rife it is. And so if you're in those communities as a Christian, and as churches we were part of would engage with churches in those sort of communities, it was no surprise that Christians in those communities did not drink. And it was a moral issue. It was wrong to drink. It was prohibited, it was taboo, it was looked down on. And so, it creates a situation of saying, so much ill has come from this thing, we should probably just ban it outright. And so it's a question of how do we manage liberty as Christians with pastoral wisdom. That's what we want to look at today. And so when Paul writes his response around this issue of sex, he is very aware of the situation on the ground. He has just been writing a strong rebuke in chapter 5 because of some of the stuff that he's heard about going on. And so I found this passage quite intriguing it obviously deals very specifically with this topic of sex and marriage and whether we should be married or not, or should we all get divorced and just be single and celibate. He goes through all the different scenarios, but I think more broadly it helps us understand Paul's approach to this dynamic of liberty and sanctification, liberty and pastoral wisdom when it comes to discipling people towards holiness. And so I think broadly we can see two things in the way Paul understands these sort of situations. Number one, God's grace and our relationship with Him transcends everything. At no point in this process does Paul take what might be the easy route and say, you know what, guys, yes, that will solve a lot of problems, just cut it out. Because Paul recognizes the scale of God's grace, and he has a big view of God's grace, and the idea that as Christians we are fully covered by God's grace, and we can't step out from underneath that into a place where we are no longer able to be redeemed by that grace. But at the same time, and this is so important for us to think about in how we manage our communities and how we engage with other Christian communities, despite his big view of grace, there is still, he makes space for pastoral wisdom and nuance, depending on the context, for the good of the people involved. So, first of all, Paul places all things under the grace of God. He takes some time to unpack the various scenarios which the Corinthians might find themselves in. In verse 1 to 5, he talks about establishing healthy expectations for sex within existing marriages. He has a big view of marriage and a clear view of what marriage is, and he speaks to people in that situation. Then verse 6 and 7, we discover that Paul holds a high view of celibacy, and he talks to that in those verses. Verse 8 and 9, he then also counsels widows and people who are currently single around marriage. And in verse 10, he discourages married people from divorcing because of this issue. He's saying, don't get divorced. Don't think that's going to solve the problem, or that is necessarily what the Lord wants. And verse 11 to 16, he provides some helpful perspective for people who have converted to Christianity but are married to unbelievers. And there will be some very complex, I imagine, sexual ethics at play in those situations. So it's all pretty even-handed, right? He expresses a preference for celibacy, which we don't talk about much in the church. We also see, though, that he holds the institution of marriage in very high regard, and that's because I think Paul would have a very clear doctrine of what marriage is, and we talked a bit about that last week. He's not willing to settle for like a half-baked version that cuts out intimacy. He's quite clear about that in his instructions to husbands and wives. But he also doesn't assume that everyone should get married in the first place, and I think that's something worthy of a bit of discussion on Thursday, just to talk about how we as a church talk about the primacy of marriage. Marriage is a wonderful thing, but it's clear from these sort of passages that it is not the only option. And some of the things I was reading say it should give us pause for thought that people like Paul and Jesus were celibate. And so I look forward to having some of those conversations. Let's continue on. So Paul is, in this passage, largely dealing with this quite specific area, but he helpfully emphasizes the big issue in verse 17 to 24. And he shows us fundamentally that we don't have to add anything or do anything in addition to receiving God's grace. There no more is required of us in order to enjoy redemption and security for our futures and our salvation in Christ. And so he talks, let's have a quick look at that. Chapter 7, 17 to 24, sorry. He says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Well, let him not seek circumcision then. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision. But what counts? Keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when you were called? Don't be concerned about it. But take your freedom if you can get it. It continues on, for he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he was called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. And so, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. That passage deals with things that we are a bit unfamiliar with, issues around Jews and Gentiles and circumcision and uncircumcision, and then the question of Christians in the church being slaves or bondservants and they're having their masters alongside. That's all quite hard to relate to. But I think what we might swap in there a bit more relatably would be questions like, are you wealthy? Great. Use what you have to glorify God. Or are you just getting by financially? Well, same thing. Continue to submit your life decisions to God. And if you get a chance for a promotion, take it. All the better to serve your family with. It's not wrong to want to do better financially. What matters is, where's my heart? Where's my devotion lying? Where's my trust for the future lying? Or you might say, are you working in full-time ministry? Great. Keep serving wholeheartedly. Good thing to invest your life into. Are you working in the marketplace? Great. Use every opportunity to present a testimony of integrity and faithfulness, and so honor the Lord with the work that you are doing. I think we could summarize it by saying your allegiance to God is primary. Okay? Before you consider, the Corinthians were asking, should we divorce? Should we just kind of cancel all risk of any sort of sexual outworkings in our lives? And God's saying, no, hang on. What's primary, what Paul's saying is, what's primary is your allegiance to God. The social condition of your life, married, unmarried, circumcised, uncircumcised, slave, master, working in full-time ministry, those things are secondary. Whatever you have now belongs to the Lord in light of the coming age. And so maybe to take it to the other extreme, we say, okay, interesting. Does that mean we can do whatever we want? We have all this liberty. God's grace transcends all parts of our lives. So does that mean we should just kind of continue to do whatever we want because grace covers it, and so it must necessarily then be beneficial for us? Obviously, we immediately recall Paul's comments in chapter 5 when he says to them, you say all things are permissible, right? Big view of grace. But Paul replies, but are they all beneficial? And you say all things are permissible, but Paul would respond again, but are you allowing certain things to dominate you? And so I think this is where Paul starts to counsel with a bit more pastoral wisdom, and I think it's so important for us to get a handle on that when we think about God's grace opens the door to many things in our life, or gives us liberty to pursue many things in life. Doesn't mean that all of them are right for us. I find Paul's epistles incredibly pragmatic in this regard. All his letters are so, I often think he was probably feeling like, oh, seriously, do I need to spell this out? But he lovingly does. And it's a great protection against that almost legalistic fanaticism that can result if we do not recognize the nuance. So, by navigating each situation on its merits, Paul is able to hold both a high view of grace, but at the same time, he can show concern for the particular context that the Corinthians find themselves in. And despite Paul clearly having a preference for celibacy, expressed in verse 7, he counsels the Corinthians that don't have the gift that they should get married, and that marriage will be a great benefit to them, and that they should give themselves wholeheartedly then in that marriage, mind and body, because he recognizes that the temptation to sin sexually will be too much for them to bear. And so that chapter 7 verses 2 to 4 says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. If the wife does not have authority over her own body, the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Just thinking about this question of like sort of pastoral wisdom in the face of grace that says all things are permissible. On my trip to the Philippines last year, late last year, we met a group of young guys who are part of the church, core part of the church. They've probably got like a sort of young adult group of about 30 people, but many of these guys have incredibly like radical redemption stories. So they've done jail time, there's been drug addiction, there's been gang membership, and now the same guys are leading Bible studies. They're preaching on Sundays, guys are leading worship, they're playing a key role in the life of the church. And at one point we're in the car and we're talking about all sorts of things. I think one of the young guys was with us, and then Selwyn, who's the senior elder in the church, he says, "Rog, I don't let the guys that I'm mentoring have girlfriends before they have completed their tertiary education." And there's this sort of awkward silence in the car, and you know, I'm sort of processing that news like, wow, okay, that's pretty heavy-handed, you know. But we're still getting to know each other, and it's a little bit awkward. But he says, Raj, like, you must understand, all of the challenges, it's all playing out within this like environment of incredible poverty, crushing poverty all around. And so you've got these guys who have come, they've been snatched from the flames, and they are now on a trajectory towards lives that are healthy, that are structured, that are going somewhere. But there's a sense that you can be like one bad decision away from all that coming down. And so in Australia, we'd say, you can't restrict young adults from dating. That's too much, man. Like, of course, Christians are allowed to date. But in that context, the pastoral wisdom gleaned over 20 years of ministry and discipleship is still saying, guys, actually, you need to get certain things into your life first before you start pursuing romantic relationships. For one, you've potentially been exposed to an approach to dating relationships which include some really unhealthy elements which we don't want to be part of your life. But secondly, one bad move here can really complicate your life. Throwing a child into the mix at this point in your life is going to really complicate it, and for your own good and your long-term health and for you to kind of live into everything that the Lord wants in your life, we're saying we're going to restrict that part. We're going to put some limits on it. And I get it. Having reflected on it and continued the conversation and seen the authenticity of relationship, it starts to make sense. But it would have, in that moment, you could have just played the grace card and said, no way, of course you can do that. Of course you can date. Of course you can have a girlfriend. So we must leave room for pastoral wisdom when we work out our lives under grace, and particularly as we disciple people and as we engage with people from other contexts. Everything is permissible, but not everything is helpful. We must not be mastered by anything. So should you take the promotion at work, we might say? Sure, unless it's obvious that it's going to have a detrimental effect on your mental health and your family life. Is it wrong to want to aspire to, leadership within the marketplace? No, not at all. But what's the cost? Is there a cost? If not, great, go for it. Should I resign and take up a full-time position in the church? Sure. But unless you're doing it to score points with God or to make people think that you are just particularly holy. Can we host a men's catch-up at the pub? This is probably more a next week question. But I'd say, yeah, sure we can. Unless we've got guys coming in from the Philippines potentially, who also have a ban on alcohol. Or maybe one of our friends locally is recovering from an unhealthy use of alcohol. Then, no, we just wouldn't. So reflecting on these issues and the way that Paul carefully unpacks liberty and responsibility, I am struck by the enormous scope we have as Christians to pursue our passions, to explore the world, travel, to marry, to not marry for that matter, to excel in the fields of our commercial activity. And all of those things can play out within biblical norms. But I'm also reminded that our motives and the state of our heart is what matters most to the Lord when we're making those decisions. But God has always intended a relationship with his people, where we could live with him, observe him, be near him. Think of the Eden situation. And obviously got the fall and sin enters the fray. By the time Jesus comes, Israel, and in particular the Pharisees, have transformed that relationship, right, that nuanced relationship that's all about the person, into an onerous set of rules and restrictions. And they're trying to fence off unrighteousness. Like the Corinthians are saying, should we just ban sex? Just put up a barrier here between us and that thing. Trying to fence it off. But what the Pharisees make the mistake of, and probably the Corinthians too, is not realizing that sin comes from inside us. You can't fence it off. You can't keep it in check with external rules and regulations. We will find ways to sin. Jesus came to restore that relationship, to get us back to that place where it's not, we don't engage through a set of rules and law. We instead engage authentically through relationship. Bring us back into the kingdom. So under the new covenant, Jesus fulfills the law, fulfills the requirements of the law, and as a result, we wear his righteousness. And we're seen with that righteousness instead of our own. So as Paul's already encouraged the Corinthians, it's now our lives, the way we live, not the thing that earn us that grace, but that act as that holy accompaniment, that unleavened bread alongside the sacrifice, that celebration of all that the sacrifice has brought us. We're the holy accompaniment to that new status that we have. And so last week Paul finished with that powerful encouragement. He said, you've been bought at a price, and now glorify God in your bodies. A holy, devoted response. How do we use our bodies? What we do with, well, we're going to choose to glorify God with our bodies. I was thinking this week he might have ended this chapter. He didn't, but he could have potentially saying, you've been bought at a price, And now glorify God in your liberty, and how we apply that liberty, in how we embrace grace, but how we also leave space for pastoral wisdom in those things. And I think there will be moments where significant restrictions are probably good, as we've seen maybe in that South African example and the Philippine example. But it's also outside of those really severe moments. We've got to recognize that it's our devotion to God that is that primary allegiance to God, which He is most concerned about. And we keep that in check. We have a lot of liberty as Christians to explore other parts of life and really good experiences along the way. Let's pray. Lord, thank you, Lord, that your word is so coherent and nuanced and deep, and that we're able to really lean into it in our lives, Lord. It's not simple kind of fanaticism, Lord, but there's a golden thread as you desire to be back with us in relationship, leading us, discipling us, mentoring us, having us do the same to the generations that follow. Just pray, Lord, you would help us to have a really robust understanding of grace, that we would be clear-eyed in the face of temptation as well, that you would help us to model really healthy lifestyles to our kids, and that you'd give us great wisdom as we counsel our kids in the next generation coming up around issues of sex, but also in all areas of life, Lord, and how we work out that liberty. These things in your name, amen. Great. We'll see you guys on Thursday. A couple of good discussion topics for us to get to there too. Cheers.